Welcome to the Author Corner, our chance to meet the authors you'll want to read. I'm Stephanie, and I'm so delighted to be joined by, well, undoubtedly my favorite author in the world. Larkin is the author of Messengers of God and Women Prophets of the Old Testament, and also my husband. So thank you for joining us.
Well, it is my pleasure to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you, not just to talk about the books, but to talk about academic writing, because it's just an interesting topic, a different way of writing. You know, people write their life story, people write, fantasy fiction. You decided to write books that are really like school books.
Can't deny that. Certainly when I hear the expression academic, I think of scholars, I think of college professors, the academics of this world. And I never really considered myself to be an academic.
Well,
I'm a high school teacher, and I've been teaching my whole adult life. Somehow or other, using the word academic to describe myself has been rather elusive.
Well, somehow you have now two reference books, award-winning reference books, on topics that were not necessarily hot topics, shall we say.
Yes, I would go along with that description. As far as writing these books are concerned, I can't speak for other teachers who have written books that have been used in the classroom. I can only speak for myself. And in all honesty, I don't believe it was ever really my intention to write a book to be used in the classroom.
Oh, really? So you wrote it for the awards, the fame, the glory?
No, I wasn't expecting any of that. And I was quite surprised when it came my way. I'm lucky enough to be teaching in a school where I was given the opportunity to develop one of my own courses.
Okay.
And because I've always had an interest in the prophets of the Old Testament, I thought I'll develop that into a course. And I did my research, and I had developed some PowerPoint presentations to present to my students, and I would distribute Bibles. And then when my wife, you, became a book publisher, I thought to myself, I don't know if I have it in me to write a book. Some people do, some people don't. I figured I was in the don't department. But I already had a lot of material in other formats that could kind of serve as a nucleus for what would go in the book. And as I wrote the book, I found that I had to do a lot more research to flesh out a lot more of the information. And I found for myself that that was a great experience. I've always liked the idea of learning as I go. And while I knew some things, I had some information under my belt about the Old Testament prophets, deciding to try to write a book and deciding to kind of embellish what I already knew with new information was actually very rewarding. Mm-hmm. And when I finally wrote the book, breathing a monumental sigh of relief that it was finished, I turned to my principal and asked her if I could possibly use this as a textbook. And she very, very graciously, I think, and with, I hope, confidence in me, said absolutely. So the first book, Messengers of God, came into being, and I was able to use it in the classroom.
Now, there are many people who don't write the book first and then ask, can I use it in the classroom? They actually are writing the book specifically to use in the classroom because there is no book.
Right.
There are entire high schools. I mean, even here on Long Island, there are entire high schools that do not use traditional textbooks. The teachers write the books, and then they use them year after year, but that way they are exactly within what they want to teach. Mm-hmm. And yours similarly, you were having this course, you had, outlined what you taught in the course, and you had no book.
Right.
You had a whole series of PowerPoints and worksheets and read this and that in the Bible, but you had no book. And then now I would guess to teach this course in the intervening years now you just kind of hand out the book on the first day of school, and now you could say to your students, please turn to page 65, and you're all in the same book.
Oh, exactly. In years gone by, the PowerPoint presentations and the Bible itself were center stage. Now all of that material with additional material has now been incorporated into the book. Right. So it's like one ready-to-use resource.
Exactly. And what's nice, I know, is you also added at the end of each chapter, questions for review. So whether it's you teaching the course or now it's available, nationwide, if somebody else is teaching the course, they've got questions and resources built in right there in the book. So it's a ready-made course.
And actually, those review questions came later. After the book was written and I started using it in class, I realized I do need to incorporate some questions for review at the end, primarily to keep the students focused or to give them something to do for homework to reinforce what we were covering in class.
Right.
So that actually came with a second printing.
Okay, but it was a great idea.
I think it was a good idea, and who knows, maybe tomorrow I'll think of something else to put in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen other people who are writing books that will put in all sorts of, I'll call them printables in the book, even crossword puzzles and word searches and tests and quizzes, so that it's even more so a book that another teacher can simply take the book if they, unlike you, don't write their own.
Yes, well, I keep my tests secret. But yes, it's certainly things that could very easily be incorporated, or I could at some point choose to expand on what's there, or incorporate perhaps another prophet who's not listed in that book. The one nice thing about writing a book such as this is you can adapt it as you go if a need develops.
You can, absolutely. And the other nice thing is if you're teaching a course for which there is no book, and I would guess that many people are, just because, the world is changing so rapidly that there's not always a book about whatever it is, or even if there is a book. Certainly I've been a teacher for many years, and many times, and I'm sure you felt this way, you don't agree with the book. You're teaching from a book that you don't necessarily agree with. I would hope that you agree with your own book.
Well, I think I do. It was interesting in that when I chose to begin to write the book, I realized I needed to acquire more information, and I suddenly began to research other books that were out there. And I did discover, which I was unaware of up until that point, that there are other books written about the Old Testament prophets. And of course, I purchased them and I would use them as resources. And I realized that some of the books that are out there are written by people whose level of scholarship, I think, far exceeds my own. And when I say that, what I'm talking about primarily is I speak English. I'd like to speak a second language, a third language, a fourth language, but I don't. And some of the scholars out there who have written similar books, are people well-versed in Greek and in Hebrew and in Aramaic, and they can discuss various translations of certain words, and that's far above my pay grade. And so again, but what's nice about that is, as I'm researching this book and reading these other books, I'm also learning as I go, and it's making me hopefully a little bit more well-rounded.
Exactly.
Which is very, very helpful.
Talk me a little bit through process, because you're talking about research. Like from the time that you said, I'd like to write a book, in case there's someone watching who's sitting there saying, I'd like to write a book. What did you do? And what were...
Well, that's a good question, actually. I had originally devised a course that was talking about some of the prophets of the Old Testament, and then other portions of the Old Testament as well, a section of the Old Testament known as the wisdom books.
Okay.
And once I decided that I wanted to write the book, I decided I need to really just focus on the prophets themselves.
Okay.
So I removed the wisdom books from the curriculum, which meant that I now had more time to talk about the prophets. But that proved to be a challenge, because I was talking about a certain number of prophets. Now I needed to expand the number of prophets I was discussing.
To invent a prophet.
Well, not to invent, but just to include.
Okay.
And I suddenly began to research prophets I hadn't incorporated in my original curriculum. So again, it gave me an opportunity to learn some things I didn't already know. But that almost segues into the second book.
Okay.
I teach, as you know, in an all-girls Catholic high school. And when I first showed my original book to some of my students and said, if you are in my course next year, this will be your textbook with the principal's permission, one of the girls, as I passed the book around, raised her hand and said, "May I ask you a question?" So I said, "Certainly." She said, "Are there any women in the book?" And I said, "Well, that's a really good question. As a matter of fact, there aren't. All of the prophets of God in this book are male." I said, "There are very few women mentioned by name as prophets in the Old Testament. But since I was teaching in an all-girls school, since I do think of myself as being something of a feminist, that immediately said to me, okay, I think there's a second book in this." So then I began to research the women prophets of the Old Testament. And then that became a little bit of a conundrum. Christianity will designate some women as prophets and describe them as such. But Judaism, and specifically some of the ancient rabbis who wrote the Babylonian Talmud, will describe other women as being prophets, different from the ones that are listed as prophets in Christianity. So to try to cover all of my bases, in the second book, I decided to put together any of the women who were designated as prophets either within Christian tradition or within the Talmud, and I incorporated also some additional women at the back of the book who I called prophets on the bubble, who seemed to display some of the characteristics of prophethood without actually being labeled as prophets in either tradition.
Okay.
And again, it all goes back to I'm learning as I go, and that's part of the fun of the whole process.
Yeah.
I think that for me, what was the most interesting part of developing the books was not just looking at what other people had written, but also asking myself, what of the things they have written that I have researched do I want to incorporate in my book? What do I want to omit? How do I want to present each of these prophets? And it was the whole creative process, I guess, of the selection of material and the presentation, right down to my choice of words, that I found actually very fulfilling, very creative. But I think that probably what I was doing was almost backwards from the way that many other academics do it. I think that there are many college professors, for example, who are required to write books as part of their, I guess, their contract. And perhaps other high school teachers as well, who say to themselves, first, I want to write a book that I will use as a course. I wanted to write a book to see if I could write a book, and then only discovered later on, ooh, I can actually use this as a textbook with permission.
Right.
So to a certain extent, I guess I was putting the cart before the horse.
Well,
At least for the first book, maybe not for the second book.
yeah. I mean, you had the course, you had some materials. How do you decide when you're doing all this research? I mean, what are we using? Google? Thank God we're not just opening up the Encyclopedia Britannica and taking it from there.
I mean, certainly Google is a great way to point you in the right direction. If you go into Google and you type in the name of a prophet, you can be led to a bunch of different websites that will provide you with the names of other books or other theologians who have written on this subject. And where it used to be necessary to go to a library to do your research, and I'm not saying it's not necessary now, but a lot of research you can do right through the internet.
Right.
And I think that's what I found that I was doing. I ordered a lot of books that I have in my work room at home that I also refer to constantly. But between the internet and hardcover and softcover books, I got a lot of material.
I'll bet you did. Did you probably had twice as much material than is actually in the book,
Oh, yes.
and then you had to glean it down to what gets to stay.
Yes, and I think I'm also writing for a very specific population too. This was what I was writing was really being tailored to the students I'm teaching. And again, I don't speak additional languages. I think there are certain areas of scholarship that are just beyond me, and I think it's just being honest. I do think, though, that a book like this, which is, or both of these books that deal with the Old Testament prophets, probably are better suited for college students than for high school students. And the only reason I'm saying that is, on the high school level, even religious high schools that offer courses in religious studies or theology, I don't believe really focus so much on the prophets. as they as they may focus on other aspects
Gotcha.
of religious studies.
Gotcha.
So, but on a college level, especially a college that offers a wide variety of courses in theology, they might be more likely to be looking for books on the Old Testament prophets because they might be offering courses.
Not to
along that
mention
line.
just regular people who have an interest, Bible study groups, things like that.
It's possible that priests, ministers, rabbis, who might want to incorporate, some of the words of the prophets or the ministries of the prophets, either in their homilies or in their parochial
Right.
endeavors, might find value in something like this.
Now,
Maybe.
it's interesting. You mentioned college professors who are often required to write. I know we've had friends that are college professors that have to write books. That's part of their tenure. You're a high school teacher who has written books, and I mentioned some other high schools, they write all their books, but it goes right down to, I know people who are teaching, middle school, and they're writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and even, kindergarten teachers who prefer or just enjoy writing their own books to use in the classroom because they kind of felt like this book that I've been using is not quite getting the job done. So for all of those people, which could be teachers from, 5-year-olds up through, graduate students, tell me something. If you were talking to all of those people about writing a book, was it harder or easier than you thought it was going to be?
That's a good question. I think I was benefited by the fact that I had a lot of resources already at my disposal to get me started.
Okay.
The difficulty was in determining what I wanted to include and what I didn't want to include, what I thought was valuable to present to the students and what was less important.
Okay.
And sometimes I had to struggle with that. Do I want to add this into this book, or do I think it's really relatively unimportant compared to other stuff?
Right.
And I think that was where the difficulties came in. I was lucky that I had other resources available, other books that I could refer to. And I think probably if other writers deemed a certain thing to be an area of importance, I might have said, okay, well, all of these people seem to think this is very, very important. Let me go with the flow.
Right. But overall, would you say that, when the book was finished, it's finally done, were you feeling like, wow, that was so much harder and worse than I thought it'd be? Or,
No.
wow, not so bad.
Yeah, no, not really. Did I breathe a sigh of relief that it was finished? Yes.
Of course.
But I think that the sigh of relief was eclipsed by a sigh of satisfaction. Simply because I simply never thought I had it in me to write a book. And I was wrong. I did. I wrote 2.
Now, did the second book go easier and smoother than the first one?
No. The second book was much more difficult.
Okay.
Because the second book was a book for which I had no pre-existing
Got it.
material.
Okay.
So all of the research had to be done from scratch.
Gotcha.
And when you're looking at the women prophets of the Old Testament, there isn't that much out there.
Right.
And that meant I had to dig all that much deeper to try to find the information. So yeah, I would say that even though the second book is not as long as the first book,
Right.
there was a lot more work that went into it from the ground up.
Right. Now, if your second book was a book about which there was more information readily available, maybe it would have been easier because you've already written a book.
Yes, I think probably having written a book already told me something about the timeline. It told me something about how to organize things. It told me how to go about presenting myself in an author's preface. So all of that helped in the writing of the second book from what I learned from writing the first book. But the research itself was more tedious. And tedious is the wrong word, because I enjoyed doing it.
Okay.
It was more extensive.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Now, in the book world, as in the movie world, it's often the things come in threes. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, we're talking trilogies here. Will there be a trilogy here?
I'm thinking of a trilogy.
Thinking of a trilogy, okay.
Well, I've mulled this over. I've thought about several different possible topics, but I think that the most logical third book to add to this series would be to write a book on the prophets of the New Testament.
Okay.
I think when people hear the word prophet, especially in its religious context, they think of Old Testament prophets. If I were to say to the average person, name a prophet, they would probably pick an Old Testament prophet. They might possibly say John the Baptist, But in the New Testament, besides John the Baptist, there are a number of people who have been described as prophets. And kind of fleshing them out a little bit might make this entire topic area come full circle.
Right.
But I think that because there is so little material of a comprehensive nature of some of the prophets in the New Testament, I think that if there is a third book, and hopefully there will be, it'll have both men and women in it.
Ooh, a co-ed book.
There will be no sexist discrimination
Right.
or differentiation, But again, I think that even from what I've seen so far, there are more men listed as New Testament prophets than women, but there are both.
Okay.
So now it's just a question of seeing how much specific information I can unearth, because sometimes the Bible doesn't say a great deal itself.
Right. Sometimes the Bible says like 2 words about something.
Exactly.
I mean, even something like the wise men. We have movies and plays and musicals and statues of the wise men. What are they mentioned in one sentence?
Well, a little bit more than that, I think, but not much more than that. We do have names for them, which is kind of good.
Yeah, well, that's true.
But even with the wise men, and we're kind of, I guess, going off topic a little bit, we have this image that they're 3 different kings from 3 different countries, which is really absurd. I think we've come to recognize the fact that if there really were wise men who visited the Christ child, they were priest astrologers from Persia. The religion in Persia at the time, the dominant religion, was called Zoroastrianism, and the priestly caste of Zoroastrian Persia were known as the Magi, and they were priest astrologers. And that fits beautifully into what we believe the 3 wise men were, and we called them Magi.
Now, just a question, because prophets are people who tell about the coming of God in many cases. Are the Magi or wise men prophets?
Maybe.
I guess I'll have to read the next book.
I mean, the reality is that the word prophet means different things to different people. For example,
Right.
A lot of people, when they hear the word prophet, automatically assume that this person is going to be making some predictions about the future.
Right.
They equate prophecy with prognostication. They're not the same thing.
Okay.
You can be a prophet is, as the title of the first book suggests, a messenger.
Okay.
Someone who is delivering a message from God. It doesn't necessarily mean that that person must make predictions about some future event.
Okay.
In the case of the wise men, and history still does not know if they are fact or fiction,
Gotcha.
but if they did exist, the prevailing theory is that they discovered an inexplicably bright star, since they had an astrological bent to their ministry, and somehow or other equated this star with their knowledge of the fact that the people of Judea were awaiting a king, and thought that they would follow this star and see if it would lead them to the king. Is that prophecy? I don't know. Is it gifted insight? I don't know. Is it a lucky guess? I don't know. Did they exist? I don't know. So that's probably a discussion for another day and a great deal more research.
Exactly. Or I'll have to read book 3 and find out where that one went.
Well, you better wait for me to write it first.
I
if
know,
that happens.
But well, I think that certainly seeing a little stack of books here, and a regular person who has survived the event could give rise to a whole bunch of people saying, hey, wait a minute, I hate my textbook. I could write that. I could do that. And it's a lot more accessible to people.
I think that's very true. And as a matter of fact, with another course that I am teaching, alongside of another teacher, we've even preliminarily, if that's a word, talked about perhaps writing our own textbook.
Yeah.
the interesting thing is we're teaching the same course. I might focus on certain aspects when in my presentation of the course. My colleague might focus on different aspects in his presentation of the course. And we thought, well, maybe if we combined all of these thoughts into one textbook, we could use it with all of our students and just picking and choosing where we want to go. So that's negotiable.
And even if a teacher or a pair of teachers, just started by collecting all of their materials in, say, a Google Drive, and putting them all in one place, even just temporarily having that the kids can either have, the students can either have a downloadable PDF, or in the good old days, we would put it all into a binder, just so that you have some sort of a resource to use that everyone is on the same page. If it turns out to be, lovely in a book, great, but how nice to have a resource.
Well, I think that a lot of teachers, especially teachers who have been teaching for a while and who've been teaching the same course or courses for a while, might discover if they did take all of their resource materials and put them together into one place, they might have a lot more stuff than they thought they had. And they might discover, wow, I might be able to develop this into a book.
Right.
But it's a question of taking a good, hard, long look at it and saying, yeah, this might be possible, or no, I don't think so.
Yeah, no, but it's good to do that kind of a spring cleaning, shall we say, of your files. Get them all in one place, put them all together, whether you just make a giant PDF to send to your students, or an online resource, or eventually a book.
That's right.
And if any of those teachers out there decide to put them into the form of a book, they too might be an award-winning author before they know it, with the possibility of a trilogy.
Well, we'll see what the future holds for sure.
Yeah, it could start with just cleaning out your computer files, and next thing you know, you have a book on your hand.
And awards are just a fortunate happenstance. I don't think that anybody writes a book necessarily expecting to win an award.
Well,
so that's just the cherry on top.
It's always nice. Well,
it is, yeah.
Hopefully you'll be back with book number 3. And hopefully for all of our teachers out there are a little bit inspired, whether you teach kindergarten or college. If you are dissatisfied with your academic material or you just want another challenge, maybe writing a book. Kieran Larkin, the author of Messengers of God and Women Prophets of the Old Testament. Thanks for joining us, and happy reading.
We're just books up on a shelf. Try to understand this if you can.